Mary. One word, spoken in a garden at dawn, to a woman who thought she was talking to a gardener. That single moment became the foundation of the largest religion in human history. And the woman who heard it. The Church would spend the next 14 centuries trying to erase who she really was. Picture this. A young woman walks into a Magdalene laundry in Ireland. It's 1952. She's 17 years old and pregnant. The nuns shave her head, take her name, and put her to work washing sheets for the next 4 years. She never sees her baby again. The institution that locked her up was named after Mary Magdalene, because the Church said Magdalene was a prostitute. But Mary Magdalene was never a prostitute. That was a mistake made by one pope in a single sermon in 591 AD. And it took until 2016 for the Vatican to officially correct it. In the meantime, 30,000 women passed through institutions that bore her name and were built on a lie. So who was she really? And what happened to her after she became the first person in history to announce the resurrection of Jesus? This is her untold story. The real Mary Magdalene, the one actually described in the Gospels, looks nothing like the woman the Church invented. Let's look at what the Gospels actually tell us. Luke chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. This is the first time Mary Magdalene appears by name. The passage says that Jesus was traveling through towns and villages, preaching and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. The 12 apostles were with him, and also certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward. Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their own resources. That's it. That's her introduction. She came from Magdala, a prosperous fishing town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. She had been freed from 7 demons, and she financially supported Jesus' ministry out of her own means. That last detail is important. It tells us she had resources. She wasn't destitute, wasn't living on the margins. She was a woman of some means who chose to use what she had to follow and support Jesus. Now, the 7 demons. We need to talk about what that actually meant in the 1st century. In the ancient world, demonic possession was the explanation for a wide range of conditions, from severe illness and epilepsy to mental disturbance and chronic pain. The text doesn't specify what Mary experienced, only that it was severe. 7, in Jewish numerology, represents completeness. So 7 demons likely meant she suffered from something profound and all-consuming. And Jesus freed her from it. Archaeologists have actually excavated Magdala, and what they found tells us a lot. The town had a major fish processing industry. Dried and salted fish from Magdala were exported across the Roman Empire. The town also had a synagogue, one of the oldest ever discovered in Israel, with stunning stone carvings. This wasn't some obscure backwater. This was a thriving commercial center. If Mary came from Magdala and had resources of her own, she likely came from a family involved in this prosperous fishing trade. But what she did next is what makes her story stand out. That experience of liberation clearly transformed her life. She didn't just say thank you and go home. She left everything behind and followed him. She became one of his most devoted disciples, traveling with his group throughout Galilee and Judea. And having women travel with a rabbi's group was highly unusual in 1st century Judaism. It wasn't forbidden, but it raised eyebrows. For Mary Magdalene to leave her home, her community, and possibly her livelihood to follow an itinerant preacher tells you something about the depth of her experience. Whatever had happened to her, whatever those 7 demons represented, Her encounter with Jesus was so transformative that she reorganized her entire life around it. She wasn't just tagging along either. All four Gospels mention her by name at the crucifixion: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In most of those accounts, she's listed first among the women present. In ancient texts, the person listed first typically held the most prominent position in the group. This wasn't accidental. The Gospel writers were telling us something. Among the women who followed Jesus, Mary Magdalene held a position of leadership. But what made her truly stand apart was what she did when everyone else fell apart. Because when the moment of crisis came, when Roman soldiers arrested Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the male disciples scattered. Peter denied knowing him 3 times. Judas had already betrayed him, but Mary Magdalene stayed. She followed him all the way to the cross. She watched him die, and she was there when they placed his body in the tomb. That kind of courage tells you everything you need to know about who this woman really was. And to understand what happened after the resurrection, you need to feel the weight of what came before it. It's Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. The Passover festival is approaching. Jesus has been arrested, tried by both the Jewish authorities and the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, beaten, mocked, and sentenced to death by crucifixion. The disciples who swore they would never abandon him have done exactly that. Roman crucifixion was designed to be the most humiliating and painful form of execution the ancient world had ever produced. The Romans wanted you to die slowly, publicly, and in full view of anyone who might think about challenging their authority. Victims could hang for hours, sometimes days, slowly suffocating as their body weight made it impossible to breathe. And standing there, watching all of this, was Mary Magdalene. The Gospel of John places her at the foot of the cross, alongside Jesus' mother, Mary, and the beloved disciple. Matthew and Mark tell us she watched from a distance. Either way, she was there. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She stood and witnessed the worst thing she had ever seen happen to the person who had given her life back to her. Think about what that took. The Roman authorities had just executed someone for claiming to be a king. Anyone associated with that person was potentially in danger. The male disciples understood this, which is why most of them disappeared. But Mary and the other women stayed, either because they were considered less of a threat by the Romans, or because their devotion was simply stronger than their fear. Probably both. And there's a detail here that many readers miss. The women who stayed at the cross weren't just witnessing a death. They were performing an act of radical loyalty in a culture that valued honor and shame above almost everything else. Crucifixion was designed to strip every shred of dignity from its victims. To stand at the foot of a cross was to publicly associate yourself with someone the state had declared a criminal. For the women to remain was not just brave, it was defiant. But the story doesn't end at the cross. When Jesus died, around 3 p.m, a wealthy follower named Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for permission to take the body. He wrapped it in linen cloth and placed it in a tomb cut into rock. And according to Mark's Gospel, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, watched where the body was laid. They noted the exact location. This wasn't passive observation. They were planning to come back. The Sabbath prevented any further action. Jewish law prohibited work from Friday evening to Saturday evening, so there was nothing she could do, nowhere she could go. Just waiting, grieving, replaying the images. The man who had freed her from 7 demons, who had given her purpose and community and hope, was dead. Everything they had built over 3 years of ministry had apparently ended on a Roman cross. Saturday must have been the longest day of her life. She couldn't work, couldn't travel, couldn't do anything but wait and grieve and replay the images of what she had seen on that cross, and prepare the spices she would need to anoint his body properly once the Sabbath ended, because that's what she was planning to do. She wasn't going to the tomb on Sunday morning expecting a miracle. She was going to say goodbye. And then came Sunday morning. All four Gospels agree on this point. Mary Magdalene went to the tomb at dawn on the first day of the week. In Mark and Luke, she went with other women, bringing spices to anoint the body according to Jewish burial customs. In John's Gospel, she went alone. The details vary slightly between accounts, as eyewitness testimonies often do, but the core facts are consistent. Mary Magdalene was there. She was the first or among the first to arrive. Think about what that walk must have been like. Jerusalem in the pre-dawn darkness, the streets mostly empty, the weight of what she was about to do pressing on her with every step. She was going to touch a dead body, which in Jewish law would make her ritually unclean. She was going to a tomb sealed by Roman authority. She may not have even known how she would get past the stone. Mark's Gospel actually records the women asking each other on the way, "Who will roll the stone away for us?" They didn't have a plan. They just went. What she found was an empty tomb. The stone had been rolled away. The body was gone. In John's account, which gives us the most detailed version of what happened next, Mary ran to tell Peter and the beloved disciple. They came, looked inside, saw the linen wrappings lying there, and went back home. But Mary stayed. She stood outside the tomb, weeping. And this is where the story takes a turn that changed history. She looked into the tomb and saw two angels in white sitting where the body had been. They asked her why she was crying. She told them someone had taken her Lord, and she didn't know where they had put him. Then she turned around and saw someone standing there. She assumed it was the gardener. "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" She said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will take him." And then he said her name, "Mary." She turned and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. One name, one voice she knew better than any other. And in that moment, the entire world shifted. Not just for Mary Magdalene, for all of human history. Jesus then told her something that carries more weight than it might seem at first. "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them." Go and tell them. That was the commission. The first announcement of the resurrection was entrusted not to Peter, not to James, not to John, but to Mary Magdalene. And that detail matters more than you might think. In first-century Jewish society, women's testimony was not considered legally valid. A woman could not serve as a witness in court. Her word, in the eyes of the law, didn't count. And yet, the risen Jesus chose a woman to be the first witness. He chose Mary Magdalene to carry the most important news in the history of his movement. Think about that from a credibility standpoint. If the early Christians had been inventing this story, they never would have chosen a woman as the primary witness. It would have undermined their credibility in the culture they were trying to convince. The fact that all four Gospels name her is actually one of the strongest arguments scholars make for the authenticity of the resurrection accounts. Nobody would have made this up. Mary went to the disciples and told them she had seen the Lord. John chapter 20, verse 18. That's one of the most understated sentences in the entire Bible. She walked into a room full of frightened men and told them that the person they had watched die on a cross was alive, that she had spoken to him, that he had given her a message for them. How did they respond? Luke tells us directly. The apostles did not believe the women. Their words seemed like nonsense. Peter got up and ran to the tomb anyway, just to check. But the initial reaction was disbelief. And you can almost understand why. They had seen the crucifixion. They had seen the body taken down. In their minds, it was over. And now a woman was telling them it wasn't. But consider what this scene actually looks like from the outside. The future leaders of the Christian Church, the men who would build the faith that now has over 2 billion followers, were hiding in a room, paralyzed with fear. And the person who brought them the news that would change everything, the message that became the foundation of Christianity itself, was Mary Magdalene. Put yourself in her position for a moment. She had witnessed the crucifixion. She had spent the Sabbath in grief. She had gone to the tomb expecting to anoint a dead body. Instead, she had encountered the risen Christ, been given a mission, and now the people she told didn't believe her. That takes a particular kind of resilience, the kind she had already demonstrated by staying at the cross when everyone else left. The title Apostola Apostolorum, the Apostle to the Apostles, was first used by the early church father Hippolytus of Rome in the 3rd century. It was later picked up by other theologians, including the great medieval thinker Thomas Aquinas. The title acknowledged something the Church understood from the very beginning. Mary Magdalene's role on Easter morning was foundational to everything that came after. But this is where the biblical account starts to thin out. And what fills the silence is even more fascinating than what came before. After the resurrection appearances, Mary Magdalene essentially disappears from the New Testament. She's not mentioned in the book of Acts. She's not referenced in any of Paul's letters. The last time we see her in Scripture is in those resurrection accounts. For a figure this important, that silence is deafening. Think about it. The book of Acts mentions dozens of people by name. Paul's letters reference co-workers, supporters, and fellow missionaries in city after city. But the woman who announced the resurrection, not a word. Some scholars believe this silence tells us something in itself. The early church was navigating the patriarchal culture of the Roman Empire, and a prominent female leader may have been deliberately downplayed in the official record as the church sought respectability and institutional authority. Others argue that Mary Magdalene simply lived out her remaining years quietly, and there was nothing dramatic to report. We don't know. And that uncertainty has occupied scholars, theologians, and storytellers for 2,000 years. Where did she go? What did she do? How did she spend the decades between the resurrection and her death? The canonical scriptures don't answer these questions, but the absence of information didn't stop the early Christian world from filling in the gaps, and the traditions that emerged are fascinating, contradictory, and sometimes deeply revealing about the communities that created them. We're going to trace every major tradition about Mary Magdalene's life after the resurrection. Some of these stories are ancient and well attested. Others are later legends that grew over centuries, and at least one of them may actually contain a kernel of historical truth. But first, we need to look at the earliest Christian sources outside the Bible, because there are texts that didn't make it into the New Testament that paint a very different picture of Mary Magdalene's role in the early church. In 1945, a farmer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt was digging for fertilizer when he stumbled on a sealed clay jar buried in the ground. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 texts. Many of them had been lost for more than 1,500 years, and several of them mentioned Mary Magdalene in ways that the official church had long tried to suppress. Now, before we get into what these texts say, keep in mind that the church decided these writings were dangerous enough to bury in the desert. That alone tells you something. The most significant of these is the Gospel of Mary, which was actually discovered earlier in 1896 in Cairo. Only fragments survive. We're missing about half the text. But what remains changes how we understand Mary Magdalene's position in the early church. In this text, she isn't just a witness to the resurrection. She's a spiritual leader, a teacher, someone the other disciples turn to for guidance. To be clear about what this text is and isn't, it's not a first-hand account. It was likely written decades after Mary Magdalene lived, and it wasn't included in the Bible because the early church councils judged it to be outside the mainstream of apostolic teaching. But the communities that wrote and preserved this text clearly considered Mary Magdalene to be an authority figure. And their perspective survived, buried in the Egyptian desert, for over a millennium. The Gospel of Mary describes a scene where the disciples are afraid and grieving after Jesus has departed. They don't know what to do. And it's Mary who comforts them and strengthens their resolve. She tells them about a private teaching she received from Jesus, a vision about the nature of the soul and its journey after death. The other disciples listen. They take her seriously, until two of them don't. But then something interesting happens. Two of the male disciples, Andrew and Peter, push back. Andrew says he doesn't believe Jesus would have shared such teachings with a woman. Peter goes further, asking whether Jesus really spoke privately with a woman in preference to them. And another disciple, Levi, defends Mary. He tells Peter that he's always been hot-tempered, and that if Jesus considered her worthy, who is Peter to reject her? That tension between Peter and Mary is going to come up again. Keep it in mind. Now scholars debate the historical reliability of this text. It was likely written in the 2nd century, decades after the events it describes. It reflects the theological views of a particular community, not necessarily what actually happened, but what it reveals is arguably just as important. It shows us that within the first few generations of Christianity, there were communities that remembered Mary Magdalene as a figure of spiritual authority. And there were tensions about that authority, specifically between her legacy and Peter's. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, goes even further. It describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion, using a Greek word, koinonos, that can mean partner, companion, or consort. It also mentions that Jesus used to kiss her often, though the manuscript is damaged at the crucial point where it might specify where. Predictably, this passage has generated enormous speculation, most of it focused on whether Jesus and Mary Magdalene had a romantic relationship. Serious scholars caution against reading too much into this. The language of spiritual intimacy in early Christian texts often used physical metaphors. A kiss, in many Gnostic traditions, symbolized the transmission of spiritual knowledge, not romantic affection. But the fact that these texts consistently elevate Mary Magdalene above other disciples tells us something real about how she was remembered in certain branches of early Christianity. And the pattern keeps showing up. The Pistis Sophia, a Gnostic text from the 3rd century, records a dialogue between the risen Jesus and his disciples. Mary Magdalene dominates the conversation. Out of 46 questions posed to Jesus in the text, she asks 39 of them. Let that number sit for a second. 39 out of 46. Jesus praises her repeatedly, calling her blessed beyond all women on earth, and tells her that her heart is directed toward the kingdom of heaven more than all her brothers. The Gospel of Thomas, another Nag Hammadi text, ends with a curious and controversial exchange. Simon Peter says to the others that Mary should leave their company because women are not worthy of life. Jesus responds that he will make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit. Scholars have debated what this means for decades. Some see it as reflecting the Gnostic idea that spiritual perfection transcends gender. Others see it as evidence of real conflict between Peter's faction and Mary's followers. And here's what's significant. That tension between Peter and Mary Magdalene appears across multiple independent texts: the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Pistis Sophia. These were written by different communities at different times. The fact that they all preserve the same conflict suggests it reflects a genuine memory of rivalry within the early Christian movement. What all these texts suggest, whether or not you accept their historical accuracy, is that Mary Magdalene's influence in the early Christian movement was significant enough to generate its own tradition. She wasn't a minor figure who faded into obscurity. She was someone important enough that different communities claimed her legacy and built their theology around her memory. But where did the actual woman go after Easter morning? For that, we need to turn to the traditions of the Eastern and Western churches, and they tell very different stories. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Mary Magdalene's story after the resurrection is both specific and detailed. According to this tradition, she traveled to Ephesus, the great city in what is now Western Turkey, and she went there with the Apostle John and the Virgin Mary. This makes historical sense for a few reasons. Ephesus was one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire, with a population estimated between 200,000 and 250,000 people. It had a massive Jewish community. It was a major center of trade and culture. And the Gospel of John tells us that at the crucifixion, Jesus entrusted his mother to the care of the beloved disciple. If that disciple was John, and if John eventually settled in Ephesus, as ancient tradition strongly suggests, then it's plausible that Mary Magdalene traveled with them. The ruins of Ephesus still stand today in Western Turkey, and they give you a sense of the scale of the city Mary would have encountered. The Library of Celsus, the great theatre that seated 25,000 people, the marble streets lined with columns. This was one of the great urban centers of the ancient world. And according to Orthodox tradition, this is where Mary Magdalene spent a significant portion of her later life. According to the Eastern tradition, Mary Magdalene didn't retreat into quiet retirement. She preached, she evangelized, she proclaimed the resurrection to anyone who would listen. The Orthodox Church considers her equal to the apostles, a title of enormous significance that places her on the same level as Peter, Paul, and the other great missionaries of the early church. That title is called Isapostolos in Greek, and only a handful of figures in Christian history have ever received it. And then there's the story of the red egg. This is one of the most beloved legends in Eastern Christianity, and even if you've never heard it, you've probably seen its effects without knowing where they came from. According to this tradition, Mary Magdalene eventually traveled to Rome and gained an audience with the Emperor Tiberius. She came to tell him about the resurrection of Jesus. She held up an egg, a symbol of new life, and declared that Christ had risen from the dead. Tiberius reportedly laughed and said that a man rising from the dead was as likely as the egg in her hand turning red, and according to the legend, the egg in her hand immediately turned bright red. Whether or not this actually happened, the story became the foundation for the Orthodox tradition of dyeing eggs red at Easter. When you see red eggs at an Orthodox Easter celebration, they represent Mary Magdalene's witness before the Roman emperor. The practice has been documented for more than 1,000 years, so the next time you see a red Easter egg, you're looking at a tradition that traces directly back to Mary Magdalene. The Eastern tradition also holds that she continued her missionary work throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Some accounts place her in areas of modern Turkey, others in regions further east. The consistent thread is that she was active, she was preaching, and she was recognized as an authoritative voice in the early church. According to the most common Eastern tradition, Mary Magdalene eventually died in Ephesus and was buried there. Her relics were later transferred to Constantinople in the year 886 AD under Emperor Leo VI. The transfer of relics was a major event in the medieval world, a sign of how important she was to the faith. The monastery of Simonos Petra on Mount Athos in Greece claims to possess the incorrupt left hand of Mary Magdalene. According to the monks, this is the very hand that touched the risen Christ in the garden. Whether you believe that or not, the fact that one of the oldest and most prestigious monastic communities in Christianity would treasure such a relic tells you everything about how the Eastern Church views Mary Magdalene. She isn't a footnote, she is central. And there's another detail from the Eastern tradition worth paying attention to. In some accounts, Mary Magdalene's preaching was direct and fearless. She didn't just share the gospel in private settings. She confronted emperors and governors directly. The story of her audience with Emperor Tiberius, however legendary it might be, reflects a memory of a woman who was never afraid to speak truth to power. She had done it at the tomb when she told the doubting apostles, and according to these traditions, she continued doing it for the rest of her life. The Eastern Church has always maintained a clear distinction between Mary Magdalene and the sinful woman of Luke chapter 7. They never confused the two. That mistake was exclusively a Western phenomenon. In the Orthodox tradition, Mary Magdalene has always been honored as a faithful disciple, a bold preacher, and a saint of the highest order. But the Western tradition tells a completely different story about where she went after the resurrection, and it involves a boat, a storm, and the south coast of France. The Western tradition about Mary Magdalene is one of the most dramatic and enduring legends in all of Christianity, and it centers on an unlikely destination, the south of France. According to this tradition, which became enormously popular in the Middle Ages, Mary Magdalene was among a group of early Christians who were persecuted in the Holy Land after the resurrection. They were placed in a boat without oars or sails and set adrift on the Mediterranean Sea, basically left to die. No food, no water, no way to steer. The group included Mary Magdalene, her sister Martha, her brother Lazarus, and several other early followers of Jesus. Now the Mediterranean is not a calm body of water. Ancient sailors feared it. Storms could appear without warning. The idea that a group of people in an oarless boat could survive a crossing of hundreds of miles is, by any practical standard, impossible, which is exactly the point of the legend. The miracle is the message, but instead of drowning, the boat miraculously crossed the sea and landed on the shores of Provence, near a place called Sainte-Marie de la Mer. The name literally means Holy Marys of the Sea, and the town still celebrates this arrival every year with a major festival that draws thousands of visitors from across Europe. According to the legend, after landing in France, the group split up to evangelize different regions. Lazarus went to Marseille, where he became the first bishop. Martha went to Tarascon, where she famously tamed a dragon-like creature called the Tarasque. And Mary Magdalene went to Aix-en-Provence, where she preached and converted the local population to Christianity. But the most dramatic part of the story comes next. After years of active ministry, Mary Magdalene withdrew to a cave high in the mountains of Provence called the Sainte-Baume. The name comes from the Provençal word for holy cave, and according to tradition, she spent the last 30 years of her life there in solitary contemplation and prayer. 30 years. in a cave. Think about that for a second. That's longer than most careers, longer than many marriages, an entire lifetime's worth of silence and prayer. The cave itself is real. It sits about 1,000 meters up in a limestone cliff, surrounded by ancient forest. Even today, the climb is demanding. In the medieval world, making that pilgrimage was a serious commitment. The cave is cool and damp, with a natural spring inside. It's the kind of place that feels sacred, even if you don't believe the story attached to it. The legend says she ate nothing, sustained entirely by angels who lifted her up 7 times a day to hear heavenly music. Her clothes eventually disintegrated, and she was covered only by her long hair. Medieval artists loved this image, and it became one of the most common depictions of Mary Magdalene in Western art. A penitent woman, barely clothed, alone in a cave, sustained by divine grace. Hundreds of paintings, from Titian to Ribera to Canova's famous sculpture, depict this exact scene. Now, let's be clear about the historical evidence for this story. There is none that dates before the Middle Ages. The earliest written accounts of Mary Magdalene in France appear in the 11th century, roughly 1,000 years after she lived. The legend almost certainly grew out of the medieval cult of saints and the desire of French churches and monasteries to claim connection to important biblical figures. And there was a very practical reason for wanting that connection. The Abbey of Vézelay in Burgundy claimed to possess Mary Magdalene's relics from the 11th century onward. The claim made Vézelay one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe. Kings and nobles came to pray there. The Third Crusade was launched from Vézelay in 1190. The economic and political power that came with possessing the relics of a major saint was enormous. Pilgrim traffic meant money, influence, and prestige. Then, in 1279, the Count of Provence announced that the true relics of Mary Magdalene had been discovered in the crypt of the Church of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume. This directly challenged Vézelay's claim and redirected pilgrim traffic and revenue to Provence. 2 regions fighting over the bones of a woman who had lived more than 1,000 years earlier. The rival relic claims became a major dispute that went all the way to the Pope. In 1295, Pope Boniface VIII sided with Provence and declared the relics at Saint-Maximin authentic. The basilica there became one of the most important churches in France, and it remains a major pilgrimage destination to this day. The skull, believed to be Mary Magdalene's, is kept in a golden reliquary in the basilica's crypt. Pilgrims still line up to see it. A strip of what is said to be her skin is visible on the forehead, preserved for over 7 centuries. Is any of this historically true? Almost certainly not, at least not in its literal form. There's no evidence that Mary Magdalene ever traveled to France. DNA testing on the relics has never been conducted, or at least never made public. The earliest Christian communities in Gaul don't mention her. The legends appear precisely when they became politically and economically useful. But the power of the story tells us something important about how Mary Magdalene was remembered. Even in a tradition that confused her with a repentant sinner, she remained a figure of immense spiritual authority. The French legends gave her 30 years of contemplative prayer. They made her a preacher who converted an entire region. They claimed that angels themselves sustained her. Whatever else these stories are, they're a testament to how deeply the medieval world revered this woman. And the tradition is still very much alive. Every year, thousands of pilgrims climb the mountain to the Sainte-Baume grotto. The Dominican friars have maintained a presence there since the 13th century. For the faithful who make that journey, it doesn't matter whether the historical Mary Magdalene actually lived in that cave. What matters is what the place represents: a life poured out in devotion. The influence of the French legends extends far beyond Provence. Mary Magdalene became one of the most popular saints in all of medieval Europe. More than 100 churches were dedicated to her in England alone before the Reformation. Magdalen College at Oxford, one of the most prestigious colleges in the world, bears her name. So does Magdalen College at Cambridge. The word maudlin, meaning tearfully sentimental, actually derives from her name, from the way she was depicted weeping in medieval art. So even the English language carries her legacy. Her story also became a central theme in European art. From Donatello to Caravaggio to El Greco, the greatest artists of the Western tradition painted Mary Magdalene again and again. She was depicted more frequently than almost any other saint. The image of her alone in the cave, hair flowing, eyes turned heavenward, became one of the defining images of Christian devotion. Even if the historical details were wrong, the emotional truth of a woman transformed by divine encounter resonated across centuries and across cultures. But while France was building shrines, the scholarly world was slowly unraveling the mistake that had defined Mary Magdalene's identity for over a millennium. For centuries, scholars had quietly noted that Pope Gregory's identification of Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman of Luke 7 had no solid biblical basis. The Eastern Church had never accepted it. Protestant reformers in the 16th century also questioned it. The French scholar Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples argued against it as early as 1517, the same year Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses. But the identification was so deeply embedded in Western culture, in art, in devotion, in popular imagination, that correcting it took an extraordinarily long time. The image of the penitent Magdalene had become too useful, too central to how the Church talked about sin and forgiveness and redemption. Letting go of it meant admitting that one of the most popular stories in Christianity was built on a mistake. The turning point came in 1969, when the Roman Catholic Church quietly revised its liturgical calendar. In the new calendar, the Feast of Mary Magdalene on July 22nd no longer identified her with either the sinful woman or Mary of Bethany. The three women were finally recognized as distinct individuals. After nearly 1,400 years, the Church officially corrected Gregory's error, 14 centuries to fix a single sermon. And it happened so quietly that most Catholics didn't even notice. But the bigger moment came decades later. In June of 2016, Pope Francis elevated Mary Magdalene's liturgical celebration from a memorial to a feast. This might sound like a minor technical change, but in Catholic liturgical practice, it was significant. A feast is the same level of celebration given to the male apostles. By elevating her feast day, Francis was making a theological statement. Mary Magdalene deserved the same liturgical honor as Peter, Paul, James, and John. The decree accompanying this decision explicitly called her the Apostle of the Apostles. That ancient title, first used by Hippolytus in the 3rd century, was now officially endorsed by the Vatican. The Church was finally saying publicly what the Gospels had always shown. Mary Magdalene wasn't a reformed sinner who tagged along with the disciples. She was a leader, a witness, and an apostle in her own right. Archbishop Arthur Roche, who presented the decree, said the decision was meant to reflect more deeply on the dignity of women, the new evangelization, and the greatness of divine mercy. Those are diplomatic words. But the subtext was clear. The Church was acknowledging that it had gotten this wrong for a very long time. And the consequences of that error were not just theological, they were real and devastating. For centuries, Mary Magdalene was the patron saint of fallen women. Institutions for reforming prostitutes were called Magdalene houses, Magdalene laundries, Magdalene asylums. In Ireland, the Magdalene laundries became notorious for the abuse of women who were locked away, forced to do unpaid labor, and treated as sinners simply for being pregnant, unmarried, or otherwise deemed immoral by society. Those institutions drew their very name from the false idea that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. A historical error committed in 591 AD had real consequences for real women for more than 1,000 years. In Ireland alone, an estimated 30,000 women passed through the Magdalene laundries between the 18th and 20th centuries. The last one didn't close until 1996. These women were locked away, forced to do unpaid labor washing clothes, and treated as morally irredeemable. Many were buried in unmarked graves. In 2013, the Irish government formally apologized for the state's role in the Magdalene laundries. The apology acknowledged what survivors had known all along. These institutions were built on cruelty, not mercy. And the woman whose name they bore would have been horrified by what was done in it. The correction of Gregory's error matters not just as a point of biblical scholarship. It matters because a wrong story about one woman shaped the suffering of thousands of others across centuries. Getting the history right has real consequences. Today, the scholarly consensus is clear. Mary Magdalene was a Jewish woman from the town of Magdala. She was healed by Jesus of a severe condition, described as 7 demons. She became one of his most devoted followers. She supported his ministry financially. She was present at the crucifixion and at the tomb. She was the first witness of the resurrection, and she was commissioned by the risen Christ to announce that resurrection to the other disciples. Everything else, the prostitute label, the romantic relationship with Jesus, the cave in France, belongs to the realm of later tradition and legend. We started this story with a woman walking to a tomb at dawn, expecting death, finding life, and being told to go share what she'd witnessed with the people who needed to hear it most. In many ways, that moment at the tomb is the whole story. Not just of Mary Magdalene, but of what the resurrection means. The first person Jesus appeared to wasn't the highest-ranking disciple. It wasn't the one with the strongest connections or the loudest voice. It was the one who showed up, the one who stayed when others left, the one who went to the tomb when there was no reason to hope. And if you think about it, that pattern repeats throughout her entire story. At the cross, she stayed when the men fled. At the tomb, she remained when Peter and John went home. Before the emperor, if we believe the Eastern tradition, she spoke when silence would have been safer. And in the memory of the early church, her voice persisted, even when others tried to erase it. Mary Magdalene's life after the resurrection, whether she traveled to Ephesus or France or somewhere we'll never know, was shaped by that encounter in the garden. She had seen the risen Lord. She had heard him say her name. And nothing, not skepticism from the other disciples, not persecution from the authorities, not the passage of time, could take that away from her. For 2,000 years her story has been told, retold, distorted, corrected, and told again. She's been painted as a penitent sinner, a secret wife, a contemplative hermit, a traveling evangelist, and an apostle. Some of those versions are closer to the truth than others. But through all of them, one thing has remained constant. She is remembered. She is honored. And the message Jesus gave her at the tomb has never stopped being proclaimed. I have seen the Lord. That's what she told the disciples. 4 words. The first Christian testimony, spoken by a woman the world tried to silence, misidentify, and forget. And yet, here we are, 2 millennia later, still telling her story. There are churches dedicated to her on every continent. Her feast day is celebrated by Catholics, Orthodox, Anglicans, and Lutherans alike. Scholars study her, artists paint her, pilgrims visit her shrines. For a woman who appears in only a handful of biblical passages, her impact on civilization has been staggering, and perhaps the most significant thing is what she represents for millions of people today. Not the distorted version, not the penitent sinner or the secret wife, but the real Mary Magdalene, the one who was healed and responded with total devotion, the one who stayed at the cross, the one who went to the tomb, the one who was trusted with the message that changed everything. History tried to turn her into someone she never was. A reformed prostitute, a background character, a cautionary tale about sin and repentance. But the biblical record tells a different story. It tells the story of a woman of means who gave up everything to follow a teacher from Nazareth. A woman who stood at the cross when the bravest men alive couldn't bring themselves to stay. A woman who was chosen, out of everyone in the world, to be the first person to see the risen Christ and the first person to announce what she had seen. That's not a footnote in someone else's story. That's a story all its own. Maybe the real untold story of Mary Magdalene isn't about where she went or how she died. Maybe it's about the fact that when everyone else gave up, she didn't, and that made all the difference. Mary Magdalene's story is one of dozens of lives hidden in the pages of Scripture that most people never hear about. If you want to see how another biblical figure's story played out after the Bible stops telling it, that video is on screen right now. And if you made it to the end of this one, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.